It is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Johan Berger, Director of the NTU-SBF Center for African Studies, to share more on understanding culture. Mr. Johan, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege just to give you a bit of a framework about what is culture, what can we expect thereof, and why is it important. If we have a look at the component elements of a culture, ladies and gentlemen, we see that it consists of quite a number of issues, quite a number of elements. And in order to understand what the typical culture of a country is, you need to understand more or less all of them. In order for you to get any inkling of what actually is going on in that country, or in that culture. My colleagues at Nanyang Business School have led me to believe that basically for every language that you find in a country, you have a separate kind of culture. In that case, if you look at Africa, it has 54 countries and about 2,000 languages. So it tells you that those that rush in without understanding the differences in culture are really setting themselves up for failure. And one would expect that African countries moving into Africa would know this. But as I will show later on, you do find at times that even companies in South Africa moving into Africa pick up a hiccup and have to move on. Cultures, ladies and gentlemen, we have our views of what goes on in every country. And you have them whether you know that or not. So when you look at what I've written there, what do you think of when you think of read of each of the following? American, Nigerian, Kenyan, South African, Japanese, Singaporean. What is the first thing that comes up in your mind? And that basically is your view, your mindset of that specific country. And it's there. Whether you like it or not, it is there. So why is culture important? In order to understand this, we need to understand what does it consist of. Kavi made the point, if you want small changes, change behavior. If you want big changes, change worldview. Now, when one has a look at a kind of a cone of influence, you find at the top you have the level of behavior. That is what we observe. It is informed in its turn by attitudes. It's also informed by values. It's informed by mental models. Mental models typically the result of that perceptual screen that we have. It has certain sizes, certain shapes, and only the information bits that fits that screen passes through. It is the result of your experience growing up, the experiences that you have, what you've been exposed to. Worldview is that eventually what gives meaning to who you are. It gives you your core identity. And as a base, we can actually have a look at your views on religion, your views on politics. If you want to change at the behavior level, ladies and gentlemen, that amount of change at the behavior level gives you that amount of change. However, small or equivalent change or size of change or scope of change at the level of attitude gives you much greater and a more sustainable change at the behavioral level. And as you go down this cone of influence, the resultant behavior change is that much bigger. And not only bigger, but also more sustainable. The reality is, however, the deeper that you go down in this cone of influence, the more difficult it becomes to change actually. One should ask yourself, is it really a company's or a country's job to change worldviews and mental models? And at an organizational level, what is important is that you actually embrace differences at the level of mental model and worldview, because that is where your innovation comes from. The problem, obviously, is the more diverse you have mental models and worldview, the more difficult it becomes, not only to manage organizations, but also to manage countries. So how then do you do that? And that's where the level of values come in. Collins and Porras made the point in their book, Built to Last, way back already, is that in order to get a country and a company, rather, in their perspective, focused in the right way, is that you need to embrace 3 to 6 core values held in a cult-like fashion. if you don't have those national values, if you don't have those organizational values that groups together people with different worldviews and mindsets and mental models, that is, you're going to have chaos and mayhem. The relevance thereof, ladies and gentlemen, in order for you as a business, I'm going to go down to the business level, you need to understand the worldview, the mental models. I call them collectively the ethos of your competitor. Understanding who your competitor is, what the values are, the attitudes, the mindsets, given a certain set of circumstances in the environment at large, you can actually predict what you can expect from those competitors. The same level goes to the consumers, the buyers, because understanding who they are, you will give them what they need. And in the way that they need, if your marketing message clashes against the worldview, the ethos of your customer, you're not going to sell anything. Suppliers, how loyal can you expect them to be in what circumstances? The regulators. Okay. And then obviously also the employees. You need to understand who your employees are, and in order for you to develop the necessary employee value proposition, that is. Looking at a view of strategy, ladies and gentlemen, like you look at this at company level and also at a national, a country level, is that ethos, this thing that we call a mindset, a culture, that will dictate, given the task thereof, what it is that you're going to see in the environment at large. And not only is what you're going to see, but also what meaning that you're going to attach to it. Because you're going to have two people looking at exactly the same phenomenon, and they're going to have total different understanding thereof and respond in a different way. And that response and the meaning that is attached to it will be dictated by the ethos. Not only will ethos give you an understanding of the environment, but as I said, it's going to have an impact on the business model, on the strategy, on the business plans, as well as then on the operating model, the structure, the use of the resources, how you're going to use them, and then also then the governance that goes with it. The type of governance will then be dictated by this ethos. When we get to the concept of national culture, ladies and gentlemen, Geert Hofstede, one of the great masters on this, not the only one, and I must confess there's a lot of criticism against some of his findings, amongst others that it is quite a European perspective. It was done based on his research that was in PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC companies right across the world in the late 60s and early 70s. But what I've done here is to show you how the US, which is the one player in the USA, in the world, in Africa, and then also India and China, two other very prominent players in the, thank you, Ambassador, in Africa. And we can see that these three countries differ quite a lot if you have a look at Hofstede's view. Power distance, that is the extent to which people within the country accept that there's a big difference. There's a power hierarchy. And we can see that the Americans do not believe that it's acceptable, whereas China and India are quite high in that regard. Individualism versus collectivism, where the individual versus the group is either dominant. We see again there the very strong focus on the individual. Both of them quite, or all three of them rather, quite the same in the terms of masculine versus feminine. Masculine being aggressive, directive, taking the decision, competitive, whereas the feminine side would be more sort of cooperative, group-based, EQ-based, I would also actually say, emotional intelligence-based. Uncertainty avoidance, the extent to which they're comfortable with differences. And then we see China being quite different from the other two, or let's put it this way, the US being very short-term oriented, competition-oriented, whereas China is sort of very much long-term. There's an urban legend that goes way back. They asked Mao Zedong what were his views on the French Revolution, and he said it's too soon to tell. So one can see that in that sort of long-term perspective. Indulgence has the extent to which you have control over your impulses and desires. If it's high, then over there you can see that the US likes spending, because the concept of, when you look at indulgence, it's about we don't have a lot of control. And where it's restrained, we do have a lot. So looking at that perspective, we see that India and China is much more restrained than the US in terms of control over desires and impulses. When we look and compare each one of those three with two countries, I took the Nigeria on the west coast and Kenya on the east coast, we can see that at least at three instances, the US is quite different from both Kenya and Nigeria. Power distance, much more egalitarian than the other two, much stronger focus on individualism, where Africa's countries tend to be more community-oriented. Masculine, the same sort of level. I found that interesting. And then the indulgence, more or less, not really the same, but up high there as well. We do not have the long-term orientation and indulgence for Kenya, however. Looking at China, we see they differ, but at different aspects of Horst Theater's factors. Very much long-term orientation, the uncertainty avoidance, and then also in terms of indulgence. And again, when we look at India, also we see at least at three levels of national culture that India differs with Africa. More or less in the same, you would find China, but quite different from that of the US. And I thought, let's fit in Singapore, just to see how they sort of fit in. And again, we find uncertainty avoidance, a big difference, long-term orientation, and indulgence. What we see from this, based on Horst Theater's view, ladies and gentlemen, is that all three of these players, which are big players in Africa in their own right, they have a much different couple of aspects, quite a different makeup as far as national culture is concerned. And yet some of them would be more successful in Africa than others would be. So the key findings of Horst Theater in this regard, ladies and gentlemen, is that power distance is quite high for Africa, meaning that they accept that there's a strong difference in hierarchy. In terms of individualism versus collectivism, Africa much more collectivist, much more group-oriented. Masculinity, low in Africa. So Africa would then, one would say, would be more feminine, would be group-oriented, would be getting everybody on board. In contrast to the US, etc., that would be much more masculine. But that would be excluding what we previously would have called the white South Africa part. Because I tease them and I say that the US declares war, the Afrikaner would say, I'm in, and 3 months later they would ask, why are we fighting again? So you need to understand that within countries, you also find contrasts. Point that I made initially, that for each language, you actually find a different culture. Uncertainty avoidance scores higher in African countries, and then the long-term orientation, Africa scores low. They're not the only people, or he's not the only person to have looked at national culture. Von Strompenaar, a Dutch guy, and his English colleague called Charles Hamden Turner had these 7 levels or 7 elements. And those of you who are interested in what they actually mean, universalism would be rules that are generally true. Particularism would be sort of, we are guided by what's going on at the moment. And countries differ on that as well. Individualism versus communitarianism, we spoke about the individualist versus the group. Specific versus diffuse. Specific would be I have a job life and I have a work life and a private life, and the two don't meet, whereas diffuse is their overlap. Mutual versus emotional has to do with the display of emotions, whereas neutral would be much more sort of the US thing. Public display of emotion is frowned upon, and emotional would be sort of the Latin countries of the world. It's quite sort of acceptable there. Achievement versus ascription. Achievement would reflect to the fact that I am what I perform, whereas ascription would be I am who I am, in the sense that the position I have in society. Sequential time would be planned one after the other, and synchronous is where you sort of combine the past, the present, and the future, and your time is flexible. And the internal direction versus external would be where the locus of control is. In themselves, also quite useful to get a view on what goes on in each one of the parts of the world. So the stereotype, ladies and gentlemen, of the indigenous African manager would be then a high level of collectivism as against being an individual. quite a humane orientation, the person is important. Above average assertivity, avoidance, and power distance. Below average levels of assertiveness and future orientation. And then also a low level of gender egalitarianism. This is a stereotype, not necessarily the case in each and every country that you do find yourself into Africa. If you look at the European origin managers in Africa, the stereotype is actually everything which the African manager is not. So diametrically opposite, the emphasis is on assertiveness, competition, work orientation, free enterprise, etc. Planning, methodology, and structure. Ubuntu, ladies and gentlemen, is an approach, mental model, culture, which basically says I get my meaning, I get my identity from the group within which I find myself. I'm not going to go into too much detail over here because I think my ambassador from South Africa might have a few things to say, and she's in any case far better qualified than I to talk on the question of Ubuntu. Two companies rather that has gone into Africa, ladies and gentlemen, that actually gives one food for thought. The one would be ShopRite, which is a food retail company that has targeted Africa. They're in about 18 countries in Africa, and made the point that they will go into Africa with startups, greenfields, and not really go the route of partnerships. And I can remember in 2003, I visited Kenya, and I was taken around by the ex-chairman of the stock exchange, Mr. Jim Nambaru, and he showed me a South African retail company. He says, Johan, that company is not going to make it. And I said to him, Jimna, why? Why not? He says, they are doing business as if they are in South Africa. And we buy differently, who buys is different, when we buy, the size of the basket, etc. And lo and behold, it wasn't long thereafter that the company did move. ShopRite itself, ladies and gentlemen, moved out of East Africa about 2 years ago in 2014, sold out to the local retailers over there, didn't understand what went on. Interesting enough, quite successful in Nigeria. Very successful in Nigeria and quite a few other countries as well. But somehow they got the East African equation wrong. Sanlam, on the other hand, looked at Africa and said, we would love to be there. Why? Because there are 1 billion people, 800 million south of the Sahara, and there's a lot of business to be done. But they learned the route in India, where they went into typical tier 2 cities and decided, we don't know the market well enough to go in from a greenfield scenario. So they went into a partnership with Sriram in India, and they took that same approach into Africa. Very successful, with one exception. In Uganda. Why? Greenfields. I think after about 7-8 years, for the first time, they started breaking even because they went up as a startup into Africa. All the other African countries they moved into, they were quite successful because they used the local partner to get access to the market, understand what the market wanted, and because they said, we don't know. It will be arrogant of us to move into an African country because we are so-called from Africa. And we have some business schools in South Africa, ladies and gentlemen, telling us, we know Africa, we train its leaders. I do chuckle. Right. But attitudes and mindsets change over time. This was The Economist in May 2000, ladies and gentlemen. It was referred to the hopeless continent. In December 2011, African Rising, Ambassador Hassan, I spoke about the issue of, or the phenomenon of Africa rising. And even as early as recently as March in 2013, Aspiring Africa. What happened since then and now is the fact that commodities did take a nosedive. Oil price is $30, $34, coming down from $110, $120, $140. And unfortunately, a lot of African countries did not use the respite that they have to diversify their economies into the world of manufacturing and into industrialize. Okay, so I was looking and said, can I find the latest? And I'm not sure whether it's fortunate or not, but The Economist doesn't have the one that says more or less what the world looks like today. The reality is, ladies and gentlemen, in the past week or so, I've had a look at so many countries and institutions still investing in Africa, still having a positive mindset, because although there are risks, there are many opportunities. What you need to do is understand what are the risks and then mitigate for those risks. If you don't do that, you are going to pick up hassles. Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully that provides you with kind of a very brief paradigm, a framework with which to understand this concept that we talk about in terms of the African mindset, the Indian perspective. Thank you very much.